أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. سبح لله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض وهو العزيز الحكيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لم تقولون ما لا تفعلون؟ كبر مقتا عند الله أن تقولوا ما لا تفعلون. إن الله يحب الذين يقاتلون في سبيله صفا كأنهم بنيان مرصوص. وإذ قال موسى لقومه يا قوم لم تؤذونني وقد تعلمون أني رسول الله إليكم فلما زاغوا أزاغ الله قلوبهم والله لا يهدي القوم الفاسقين. وإذ قال عيسى ابن مريم يا بني إسرائيل إني رسول الله إليكم مصدقا لما بين يدي من التوراة ومبشرا برسول يأتي من بعد اسمه أحمد. فلما جاءهم بالبينات قالوا هذا سحر مبين. ومن أظلم ممن افترى على الله الكذب وهو يدعى إلى الإسلام والله لا يهدي القوم الظالمين. يريدون ليطفئوا نور الله بأفواههم والله متم نوره ولو كره الكافرون. هو الذي أرسل رسوله بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله ولو كره المشركون. يا أيها الذين آمنوا هل أدلكم على تجارة تنجيكم من عذاب أليم تؤمنون بالله ورسوله وتجاهدون في سبيل الله بأموالكم وأنفسكم ذلكم خير لكم إن كنتم تعلمون. يغفر لكم ذنوبكم ويدخلكم جنات تجري من تحتها الأنهار ومساكن طيبة في جنات عدن ذلك الفوز العظيم. وأخرى تحبونها نصر من الله وفتح قريب وبشر المؤمنين. يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا أنصار الله كما قال عيسى ابن مريم للحواريين من أنصاري إلى الله قال الحواريون نحن أنصار الله فآمنت طائفة من بني إسرائيل وكفرت طائفة فأيدنا الذين آمنوا على عدوهم فأصبحوا ظاهرين. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
اے چاند کربلا کے، تو نے تو دیکھے ہوں گے، اترے تھے سے زمیں پر عرش بری کے تارے، اے چاند کربلا کے، اے چاند جلوہ گر ہے ہاشم کا چاند یہاں پر، اے چاند جلوہ گر ہے ہاشم کا چاند یہاں پر، خیرات روشنی کی لے لیجیو یہاں سے، اے چاند، اے چاند اس زمین پر رکھیو ہمیشہ ٹھنڈک، سوتے جو ہیں یہاں پر زہرا کے ہیں یہ پیارے، اے چاند حر اور حبیب جیسے جانباز اور رہباں مارے گئے یہیں پر، انصار شاہدیں کے، اے چاند مارے گئے یہیں پر بے دردیوں ستم سے، مسلم کے دونوں پیارے زینب کے دونوں بیٹے، اے چاند پامال ہو رہی تھی قاسم کی لاش رن میں، عباس اور سرور چنتے تھے ان کے ٹکڑے، اے چاند کربلا کے، تو نے تو دیکھے ہوں گے، اترے تھے سے زمیں پر عرش بری کے تارے، اے چاند کربلا کے، اور محمد و آل محمد صلوات۔
اکبر کی ماں سے کہتی تھی رو کر وہب کی ماں، اکبر کی ماں سے کہتی تھی رو کر وہب کی ماں، بی بی میرا پسر کہاں، اکبر تیرا کہاں، اکبر کی ماں سے کہتی تھی رو کر وہب کی ماں، اکبر کی ماں سے کہتی تھی رو کر وہب کی ماں، بی بی یہ سوچ کر مجھے آتا نہیں ہے چین، اکبر کا درد دیکھیں گے کیسے بھلا حسین، روتے تھے وہ وہب جو رگڑتا تھا ایڑیاں، اکبر کی ماں سے کہتی تھی رو کر وہب کی ماں، ہم نے تو کلمہ پڑھ لیا اکبر کو دیکھ کر، یہ کیسے لوگ ہیں جنہیں شک ہے حسین پر، لگتا ہے مجھ کو کوئی مسلمان نہیں یہاں، اکبر کی ماں سے کہتی تھی رو کر وہب کی ماں، آنسو خوشی کے بہنے لگے غم کے ساتھ ساتھ، مقتل میں نے دیکھا جو پہلو پہ رکھے ہاتھ، روتی تھی میرے لال کو اکبر کی دادی جان، اکبر کی ماں سے کہتی تھی رو کر وہب کی ماں، خود اپنی تربیت پہ کیا شکر کبریا، زوجہ سے جو وہب نے وصیت میں یہ کہا، فضا سے پہلے ہاتھوں میں بندھوانا رسیاں، اکبر کی ماں سے کہتی تھی رو کر وہب کی ماں، میں زوجائے وہب سے یہ کہہ دیتی ہوں ابھی، وہ بھائی کہہ کے لاش پہ اکبر کے روئے گی، میں نے سنا ہے فاطمہ صغریٰ نہیں یہاں، اکبر کی ماں سے کہتی تھی رو کر وہب کی ماں، وہب کی لاش پہ لیلا نے یہ کہا، سجاد اس سے بھر کے مقدر ہو اور کیا، رن میں شہید ہو گئی بیٹے کے ساتھ ساتھ، اکبر کی ماں سے کہتی تھی رو کر وہب کی ماں اکبر کی ماں سے کہتی تھی، رو کر وہب کی ماں بی بی میرا پسر کہاں، اکبر تیرا کہاں، اکبر کی ماں سے کہتی تھی، رو کر وہب کی ماں اکبر کی ماں سے کہتی تھی، رو کر وہب کی ماں.
بر محمد و آل محمد صلوات اللہم صلی علی محمد و آل محمد وعجل فرجہم. میرے حبیب میرے دوست کربلا جا، میرے حبیب میرے دوست کربلا جا، تمہیں بلاتا ہے زہرا کا لاڈلا جا، میرے حبیب میرے دوست کربلا جا، تمہارے آنے سے صحرا میں مجھ کو چین ملے، ملے حسین سے تو اور تجھے حسین ملے، نادر ابن مظاہر تو اب لگا جا، میرے حبیب میرے دوست کربلا جا، علی کے لال سے امت نے منہ ہی پھیر لیا، سلگتے دشت میں ابن بطول گھیر لیا، کٹھن یہ وقت ہے اے میرے ہم نوا جا، میرے حبیب میرے دوست کربلا جا، علی کی بیٹیاں ہمراہ میرے آئی ہے، بچان دین وہ بچے بھی ساتھ لائی ہے، اگر تو آئے برے ان کا حوصلہ جا، میرے حبیب میرے دوست کربلا جا، مدینہ چھوڑ گیا کربلا میں آیا ہوں، میں ایک عظیم سا مقصد بھی دل میں لایا ہوں، مجھے معلی بنانی ہے یہ جگہ جا، میرے حبیب میرے دوست کربلا جا، عطاعتوں میں وفاؤں میں لاجواب ہے تو، علی کے بیٹے کا بے مثل انتخاب ہے تو، ना इंतजार ज़्यादा मुझे करा जा, मेरे हबीब मेरे दोस्त करबला आजा। तौक़ीर अपने वतन को हबीब ने छोड़ा, ज़माने सारे को उस खुश नसीब ने छोड़ा। जो ख़त में मौला का लिखा हुआ पड़ा जा, मेरे हबीब मेरे दोस्त करबला जा। तुम्हें बुलाता है ज़हरा का लाडला जा, मेरे हबीब मेरे दोस्त करबला जा, मेरे हबीब मेरे दोस्त करबला जा, करबला जा। बर मोहम्मद व आली मोहम्मद सल्लल्लाहु अल्लाहुम्मा सल्ली अला मोहम्मद व आली मोहम्मद व अज्जल। सूरतुल मुबारकतुल फातिहा।
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. ثم الصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا وشفيع ذنوبنا أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. أما بعد، فقد قال الله سبحانه تبارك وتعالى في محكم كتابه المجيد وفرقانه الحميد وقوله الحق: ومن آياته خلق السماوات والأرض واختلاف ألسنتكم وألوانكم إن في ذلك لآيات للعالمين. صدق الله العلي العظيم. One of the important issues that we need to talk about, and it is a burning question for us today, is the question of racism in Islam. What does Islam have to say about racism? Does Islam allow racism? Does Islam have any basis which it provides for racism or not? This is particularly important because, as we know, in the world today, we're finding that due to the rampant racism that exists in the Western societies, and which translates into different kinds of atrocities that are meted out on the African Americans, for example, such that you find that they are brutalized and even terrorized by the police and by others. We find that this is something that has brought about questions for us, because Islam is and continues to be the fastest growing religion in the world. And we have many African Americans who are Muslims, and inshallah in one of these nights we will talk about Islam in Black America, inshallah. But what we want to talk about now is Islam's position on racism, because as we are speaking right now, protests are still ongoing in many parts of the Western world. The Black Lives Movement is coming out to protest this rampant brutality against blacks for no other reason but their skin color. And this is something that is a bane on human society. And it is a problem for us indeed. So we need to address it. And what better place to address it than in the beautiful platform that has been provided to us by Aba Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salam through his sacrifice. This is the best place where we can discuss such important issues as racism in Islam. Now let us look at it first and foremost through the lens of the Holy Quran. The verse that I have recited just now is from Surah Al-Rum, verse number 22, in which Allah Azza wa Jal says, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ خَلْقُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافُ أَلْسِنَتِكُمْ وَأَلْوَانِكُمْ إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِلْعَالِمِينَ. Among his signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth and the difference of your languages and colors. There is indeed a sign in this for those who know. From this verse, we realize that the differences in the languages of human beings and in their skin color is just one of the signs of the creation of Allah Azza wa Jal. And indeed, the beauty of Allah's creation lies in its diversity. We know that diversity is what brings beauty. Imagine a situation where all the flowers of the world were the same color and the same shape and the same size and had the same fragrance. Or all the animals in the world looked alike. Or all the human beings looked exactly alike. There would be no diversity. And with no diversity, there is no beauty. So it's part of the beauty of the creation of Allah Azza wa Jal that He created everything unique. He made everything unique. And in the uniqueness, there is diversity. And in diversity, there is beauty. That is what Allah Azza wa Jal tells us in the Holy Quran regarding the differences in the skin colors that we find amongst human beings. Similarly, in another verse in Surah Al-Hujurat, verse number 13, Allah Azza wa Jal addresses human beings and says, يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسِ إِنَّا خَلَقْنَاكُم مِّن ذَكَرٍ وَأُنثَى وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِندَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ عَلِيمٌ خَبِيرٌ. Allah Azza wa Jal tells us, O mankind, we created you from a male and female and made you nations and tribes so that you may identify yourselves with one another. Indeed, the noblest amongst you is the one who has God-wariness, the one who has God consciousness. The noblest and the most honored in the sight of Allah Azza wa Jal is the one who is more pious and more muttaqi. Now, we want to talk about racism, so let us define racism. What is racism? Racism is a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capabilities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority in a particular race. So basically, racism therefore means that one race, due to the inherent qualities it has, because every race has certain inherent qualities, one particular race, due to the qualities that it has, is superior to others. That is known as racism. Now, of course, we know that racism is not something that is in the fitrah of human beings. You are not born a racist. Rather, when human beings are born, they have no inkling towards such thoughts, racist thoughts and ideas. This is seen when you look at children. Children, 1, 2, 3-year-olds, they play with one another and they don't even see the differences in their race. A black child would play with a white child without noticing any difference in skin color. And this shows that racism is not in the fitrah of human beings. Rather, it is something learned through community, learned through family, learned through society. And this is something we need to realize. And because it is learned, it can be unlearned. It is something that can be prevented. It is something that we can remove from our community as well. Now we know that all human beings are descendants of a common ancestor. We are all from Adam alayhi salam. And so there is no difference when it comes to our makeup. Regardless of race, when a human being bleeds, the blood is red. It makes no difference what your skin color is. In these times of the corona pandemic, we find that it does not distinguish between race. Black people suffer from the virus just as much as white people do, and so on and so forth. So maladies and ailments and sicknesses do not distinguish between race. And the same goes for spiritual maladies, spiritual sicknesses. Just as physical sicknesses and maladies do not distinguish between race, so too spiritual sicknesses do not distinguish between race. So if we look at diseases of the soul such as greed or jealousy and so on and so forth, you find that it affects all races of human beings. And therefore we find that spiritually there is no difference between human beings. Even though physically, outwardly, you might find some differences in physical characteristics or in skin color and so on and so forth. But spiritually, human beings are not different from one another because they all suffer similar diseases. It's quite interesting. We're talking about diseases of the soul. So there is one anecdote that comes to mind, and that is during the time of Harun al-Rashid, or one of the previous caliphs. We find that the caliph asked to hear a hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi from one of the companions who is still alive. Of course, there were some companions who are said to have lived very long. They are known as the Mu'ammarin, those who lived for a long time. And so this caliph instructed his soldiers to look around the kingdom and find somebody who has heard a hadith from Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi directly. And so they looked around and they found an old man who had heard a hadith from the Prophet, but he was so old and frail that he could not walk. So they carried him on his bed to the caliph. And when he came to the court of the caliph asked him, "Have you heard a hadith from the Holy Prophet?" The man said, "Yes." He said, "Can you narrate it for me?" And the man began. He said, "I heard with my own 2 ears from Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi that he said that as a man grows older, 2 things in him grow stronger: greed and lengthy aspirations, long hopes." So the caliph was very happy, and he instructed that the old man be given a pouch of gold coins. When the old man opened the pouch and he saw the gold coins, he was so happy. And as the soldiers carried him back to his house, just as they were about to leave the palace, the old man said, "Take me back to the caliph, I have a question." So they brought him back to the caliph, and he asked the caliph that, "I have a question, may I present it to you?" The caliph said, "Sure." And he said that, "You have given me this pouch of gold coins for one hadith. If next year I remember another hadith of Rasulullah, can I come back to your palace and will you give me another pouch of gold coins?" Upon hearing this, the caliph began to laugh, and he said, "Indeed, the Holy Prophet's statement was true. Look at you, such an old man, but despite being old, you are so greedy that you are thinking about a second pouch of gold coins, and you have so much hope and aspiration that you will live for another year, such that you will come back to me and I will reward you again." Sallu ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. So we find that, coming back to our topic of racism, that spiritual diseases do not distinguish based on race. Every race suffers from these spiritual diseases just as they suffer from physical diseases. And when it comes to Islam, Islam has a very strong egalitarian ethos. Islam believes in equality of human beings. There is no place for racism in Islam. We have already seen the 2 verses of the Holy Quran. The first one, where Allah Azza wa Jal says the differences in skin color is a sign of the creation of Allah. It is a sign of the beauty of Allah's creation. And in the second verse, the differences in tribes and races was just a means of identification. So we are told that it is a means to identify ourselves. So this is something that we need to realize, that Islam does not promote racism, does not even allow racism. In fact, it tries to remove all these notions of racism. And we see this even in our acts of worship, for example. We know that when Muslims go for Hajj, or even when they pray Salatul Jama'ah, there is no distinction. A white man will stand next to a black man will stand next to a brown man, and they will all stand together and pray to Allah together. And they will all circumambulate the Kaaba together, and they will all perform the Hajj together, and there is no distinction. In fact, in the Hajj, even the clothing that you are meant to wear, the ihram, is the same. And so that brings the human beings down to a level where they realize that there is no superiority based on race or skin color. Now compare this to other religious traditions or other ideologies. As an example, let us look at the Jewish beliefs. In Judaism, there is the belief in the chosenness of Jews, meaning that Jews believe that they are the chosen people of God. That is one of the tenets of Judaism. And of course, the Holy Quran rejects this idea and tells the Jews through the Holy Prophet, قُلْ إن كانت لكم الدار الآخرة عند الله خالصة من دون الناس فتمنوا الموت إن كنتم صادقين. Tell them, O Prophet, if the abode of the hereafter were exclusively for you with Allah Azza wa Jal and not for other people, then desire death if you are truthful. Of course, they would not desire death because they know what awaits them after death due to their actions in this world. And there is a very interesting quote by Einstein, the famous scientist, who himself was a Jew. He says, "For me, the Jewish religion, like all others, is an incarnation of the most childish superstitions. And the Jewish people to whom I gladly belong and with whose mentality I have a deep affinity have no different quality for me than all other people. As far as my experience goes, they are no better than other human groups. Although they are protected from the worst cancers by a lack of power. Otherwise, I cannot see anything chosen about them." This is what Einstein wrote in his letter to Eric Gutkind in January of 1954. And the letter is available online for those who want to refer to it. And this was one of the last letters that Einstein wrote towards the end of his life. In it, Einstein, being a Jew himself, says, "I do not see any difference between the Jews and other people. There is no question of chosenness." Now imagine if you believe that your race is a chosen race, then it becomes very easy for you to look upon others as being inferior. Islam, on the other hand, rejects this notion completely. Islam says that all human beings are equal and the only distinguishing factor is taqwa of Allah Azza wa Jal, is belief. If you are a mu'min, if you are a believer, then you are better than a non-believer. If you are pious, if you are God-weary, then you are better than one who is not pious. Islam does not say that your skin color or your race or your ethnicity is the cause of your superiority. This is something that is rejected by Islam. In fact, we have a number of narrations from the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that clearly show that there is no racism in Islam. It is reported that in one instance the Holy Prophet said, إِنَّ النَّاسَ مِنْ عَهْدِ آدَمْ إِلَى يَوْمِنَا هَذَا مِثْلُ أَسْنَانِ الْمُشْطِ لا فضل للعربي على العجمي ولا للأحمر على الأسود إلا بالتقوى. It is narrated that the Holy Prophet told the people that human beings from the time of Adam till today are like teeth all together lined up. There is no difference between the Arab and non-Arab. There is no superiority of an Arab over a non-Arab, or of a red-skinned person over a black-skinned person. We are all from Adam. We are all from one ancestor. The only distinguishing feature, as the Prophet mentions, is taqwa, is God-wariness. In another tradition from the Holy Prophet again, he addressed the people and said, يا أيها الناس إن العربية ليست بأب وجد وإنما هو لسان ناطق فمن تكلم به فهو عربي ألا إنكم ولد آدم وآدم من تراب والله لعبد حبشي حين أتى الله خير من سيد قرشي عسى الله. The Holy Prophet said, being an Arab is not through lineage of father and grandfather. Rather, anyone who speaks the language is an Arab. And there is no superiority of an Arab over a non-Arab. We are all from Adam, and Adam was from dust. And then he says, I swear that an African slave who worships Allah is better and superior to an Qurayshi nobleman who disobeys Allah Azza wa Jal. And so here again the Holy Prophet says and shows us that the distinction lies in obedience to Allah, in piety, not in skin color, not in ancestry, not in ethnicity. So now, when we look at these ahadith and we couple them with the ayat of the Holy Quran, then we find that without a doubt, Islam is against racism totally and completely. And of course, this is further emphasized by looking at the history of Islam. We look at Bilal al-Habashi, for example, one of the most famous and well-recognized companions of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi. He was loved by Rasulullah, by the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. And his adhan is what the Prophet loved to hear. In fact, it is mentioned that many years after the Prophet had passed away and Bilal had left Medina because he could not bear to be there without Rasulullah, one day he came back to Medina, and when he recited the adhan, because they requested him, Bilal, you have come back to Medina after so many years, please recite the adhan. When he recited the adhan, people began to weep because it reminded them of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi. This is one example. Also come to Karbala. We have John, the companion of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, who gave his life for Aba Abdullah al-Hussein in Karbala. And Aba Abdullah praised him. And he was part of those companions who are the best of companions, in the words of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein. So we find that there is no place for racism in Islam. And because of the egalitarian nature of Islam, it has moved many people to accept Islam, especially those who have suffered racism. Look at the example of Malcolm X. Malcolm X used to be part of the Nation of Islam, and he once came for Hajj. Before coming for Hajj, he had this idea, and he would constantly in his speeches say that the white man is to blame for all the woes of the black man, and he would criticize all white people. When he came for Hajj, he witnessed all Muslims coming together as one. White and black and brown and blue and yellow, all of them coming together as one. And it changed his thought. And he said, I will no longer generalize, for I have seen that indeed there are some good white people. I will no longer generalize and blame the entire white race. It is that egalitarian nature of Islam. In Islam, we don't see your skin color. As long as you are a true believer, then you are a brother in faith, and we consider you an equal. It is something very interesting, and many times this kind of difference in the way we perceive others is based just on misconception. There really is no reason to consider yourself a better race than any other member of another race. There is no reason. We find good and evil people in every race and from every background. So the distinguishing characteristic should not be something that is beyond the control of a human being. How can you distinguish and give superiority and consider someone to be superior just based on something which is beyond his control? If you consider me to be inferior because I am brown, did I choose to be brown? Did I do anything? Did I make that decision? Did you do any great deed that made you white, for example? And so these kinds of thinking is actually counterintuitive. It even goes against the very basic logic that human beings understand. There is a very interesting anecdote, a parable that Rumi mentions in Mathnawi. He says there were 4 individuals from different ethnic backgrounds. There was a Persian, an Arab, a Turk, and a Greek who were traveling together, and a person, seeing their poor state, gave them 1 dirham. So they began discussing amongst themselves on what they should buy with that dirham. The Persian said, "Let us buy angur." The Arab said, "No, let us buy inab." The Turk said, no, we buy unum. And the Greek said, no, we should buy astafil. And they began quarreling amongst themselves. At that moment, an old wise man who knew all 4 languages came, and he heard them debating, and he stopped them and he said, "Do you know you are arguing about the same thing? All of you want grapes. You are just saying grapes in different languages, and you are quarreling because of misunderstanding one another. Had you understood one another, you would realize that there is no difference in what you want." There is this common humanity that people tend to forget about when they look at superficial differences, how big a person's nose is or what color their skin is. What does that have to do with a person's humanity? And indeed, in Islam, we are told that we should never discriminate against a person based on their race. Of course, that does not mean that there are no racist Muslims. No, unfortunately, there are Muslims who suffer from this disease of racism. But that is very different from saying that Islam allows racism, as we have seen in the Quran and Hadith, and even in history during the time of the Prophet and the Imams. In fact, you will know that many of the mothers of the Imams were from different races. We find that there is absolutely no place for racism in Islam. Now, then, how do we explain racism in the Muslim world? We explain it in different ways. One, of course, we know that it is a sickness that some Muslims have. And it could be argued that this disease actually is something that was imported into the Muslim world from the Western world. As the Muslims took the culture of the Westerners, they also took many of the flaws in their thinking. And so maybe if you look back in history, you will find less racism in the Muslim world in the pre-modern time when you compare it to the modern time. Of course, we are not saying there was no racism, but the amount of racism we find today in the Muslim world, in the Arab world, and in many parts of the Muslim world, we will see that it is because that racist ideology that is so prevalent and common in the West slowly began creeping into Muslim lands and among Muslims. Otherwise, Islam is totally against racism, and good Muslims therefore are not racist and cannot be racist, because racism is against Islam. Now, as we talk about the ideology that Islam propounds, Islam teaches us that we should not look at race, rather we should focus on belief and unity amongst believers. This is very important. When you look at the Holy Quran, the Quran again is very clear as it tells us, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا واذكروا نعمة الله عليكم إذ كنتم أعداء فألف بين قلوبكم فأصبحتم بنعمته إخوانا. Hold fast together to Allah's rope and do not be divided amongst yourselves. Remember Allah's blessing upon you when you were enemies. Then He brought your hearts together and you became brothers by His blessing. So in Islam, believers are brothers. Believers are meant to come together as a united front, as one entity, as one group, and through that unity there is strength amongst the believers. In fact, when you look at the traditions, you find that they beautifully explain how believers are like a single body. There is a hadith from Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam in which he says, المؤمنون في تبارهم وتراحمهم وتعاطفهم كمثل الجسد إذا اشتكى تداعى له سائره بالسهر والحمى. Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi says, in their love for one another and their compassion towards one another, believers are like a single body. If part of the body aches or pains, the whole body is sleepless and restless and gets a fever. So you find if you have a headache, if you have a toothache, the whole body is uneasy. Similarly, if part of the Muslim Ummah is suffering, the others are all uneasy and restless. This is the beauty of Islam. Islam considers all Muslims to be one body. We are all brothers in Iman. And so there is no place for trying to show superiority over your brother because of the color of your skin. This is foreign to Islam. This is an idea that Islam rejects. And because of this, the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi is reported to have said, إِنَّ الْقَلِيلَ مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ كَثِيرٌ. Indeed, even a small group of believers is a lot. Why? Because they are so united and strong that they can handle problems that many people together would be unable to handle or to face. Now, of course, when we turn to the Western world, we find there is systemic racism in the Western world. The case of George Floyd, which has caused so much upheaval and protests, and the protests are still ongoing. And even in the past, before and even after that, we have seen videos and we have heard accounts of brutality and very rough behavior and very unfair behavior against certain races in America and in parts of the Western world, in Canada as well, in Europe as well. It is this idea of being inferior to us that they have in their minds, and they consider these other races to be inferior, and that is why the white race tries to suppress all other races. Of course, here we do not wish to generalize. As we saw, there are some white people who are good and who are not racist, but those who are racist, they believe that because of the color of their skin, they are better than other people, and they use all sorts of justifications, but there is really nothing that can justify this kind of racism. If you go back into the history, you will find that white people actually, in the dark ages in Europe, the way they used to live, they were barbarians. They never used to care for physical hygiene. They never used to care for even the very basic actions that would come to determine whether a person is civilized or not. I mean, they were completely uncivilized individuals. You know, it's quite interesting. There is a saying in English, don't throw the baby out with the bath water. Now, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf tells us in one of his lectures that this saying came about because in the Dark Ages, the white people would not take a bath, the Europeans would not take a bath often. In fact, sometimes it would be an annual event. They would take a bath after a whole year. Now, when they would take that bath, there would be a huge tub where water would be filled, and the father of the family would first sit in that water and take a bath, and then the mother, and finally the children, and finally, after everyone had taken a bath, the small babies would be bathed in that water. By that time, obviously, the water was murky and dark because everybody had taken bath in that water. And so if the baby fell into that tub and they wanted to remove the baby, they would remove the water and they would be careful not to throw out the baby with the bath water. And that is where the saying, do not throw the baby out with the bath water, came from. Now you can imagine, this is just one example of the Dark Ages in Europe and what kind of people they were. At that time, there were people in other parts of the world who were much more civilized. And so the pagans were the white people at that time. You know, the barbarians, the uncivilized lot, were those with white skin. So how is it that you can justify superiority based on the color of skin? Just because you have light skin, you are superior. That is something that is completely unacceptable and wrong. Islam, on the other hand, gives us a way of evaluating and of valuing individuals. What is it that gives human beings value? There are three things Islam mentions that give human beings value. The first thing is taqwa. Obviously, as we have read in the ayah in the beginning of the talk, Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. Indeed, the most honored amongst you is the one who has taqwa. So this is something that we realize, that taqwa and being mindful of God and being wary of God and being careful and being God conscious is what gives a person taqwa. Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi is reported to have said, ittaqillaha wa kun haythu shi't wa min ayyi qawmin shi't. He is reported to have said, have the taqwa of Allah, and then you may be from any place that in the world, or from any community, any tribe. It makes no difference. As long as you have the taqwa of Allah Azza wa Jal, you are an honorable person. So that is the first thing that gives human beings value. The second thing that gives human beings value according to Islam is knowledge. In Surah Al-Zumar, we are told, Allah Azza wa Jal asks, قُلْ هَلْ يَسْتَوِي الَّذِينَ يَعْلَمُونَ وَالَّذِينَ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. Say, are those who know equal to those who don't know? Obviously, those who know and are knowledgeable cannot be compared to those who don't know. In another verse, Allah Azza wa Jal also states and highlights the importance of knowledge by showing that those who have knowledge are of a greater value than those who don't. He says, إِنَّمَا يَخْشَى اللَّهَ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ الْعُلَمَاء. Only those of Allah's servants who have knowledge fear Him. So this is something very important. We find that those who have knowledge have value. They are the ones who can come closer to Allah Azza wa Jal. They are the ones who have a higher status in the eyes of Allah Azza wa Jal. And that is why Imam As-Sajjad alayhi salam is reported to have said, لو يعلم الناس ما في طلب العلم لطلبوه ولو بسفك المهج وخوض اللجج. It is reported that Imam As-Sajjad alayhi salam said that if people knew what benefits there are in gaining knowledge, they would have sought knowledge even if it meant spilling their blood or going into the depths of the oceans. You can imagine how important knowledge is. And indeed, in one report we are told that Allah Azza wa Jal revealed to Prophet Daniel, peace be upon him, that the worst and most hated of my servants in my eyes is the one who doesn't have knowledge, he's an ignoramus, and he mocks or taunts or undervalues or disrespects those who have knowledge. So imagine if a person himself does not have knowledge and then disrespects those with knowledge, then that person falls into the category of the most hated people in the sight of Allah Azza wa Jal. Of course, when we are talking about knowledge, we know that we should gain knowledge in order to attain the proximity of Allah Azza wa Jal. Not for the reason of trying to show how clever we are or for trying to debate with other people. No. There's an anecdote of a young man who had studied Arabic grammar, ilmun nahu. And after a long time of difficult study, because it's a very difficult subject, he gained mastery over ilmun nahu. And he was very proud of himself that he had become a master of a science which many people found difficult. One day he was traveling on a ship and he came to the captain and he started talking to the captain and he said, "Have you studied ilmun nahu?" So the captain said, "No, I have never studied Arabic grammar. I don't know about it." So the man said, "Then you have wasted half of your life." Of course, this was a way of boasting about his abilities in this science. After a while, a storm came and the ship was about to break up and was about to sink. So people had to jump overboard in order to save their lives. At that moment, the captain asks that young man, "Have you learned how to swim? Do you know how to swim?" The young man said, "No." So the captain says, "Then you have wasted your whole life." Sallu ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. So the second thing Islam says gives value to human beings is knowledge. Taqwa and knowledge. The third thing that gives value to human beings is hard work. Working hard gives you value. The Quran says quite clearly, وَأَن لَيْسَ لِلْإِنسَانِ إِلَّا مَا سَعَى. There is nothing that a human being can acquire, can obtain except through hard work. Whatever he acquires, it is through his hard work. And in another verse we are told, وَمَنْ أَرَادَ الْآخِرَةَ وَسَعَى لَهَا سَعْيَهَا وَهُوَ مُؤْمِنٌ فَأُولَٰئِكَ كَانَ سَعْيُهُمْ مَشْكُورًا. And whoever wishes for a status, a place in the hereafter, and strives for it the way he ought to, then his striving will be appreciated, meaning that he will attain the status that he wishes to attain. So even for akhirah, even for Jannah, even for wanting to have access to paradise, it is not something that comes free. You have to work very hard for it. And there is a report that one time a caravan had gone for pilgrimage, and when they came back, they came to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, and they said, Ya Rasulullah, there was one man with us in our caravan who was very pious. He would constantly do ibadah of Allah Azza wa Jal. He would worship Allah and praise Allah from morning to night. He was constantly on his prayer mat. So Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi asked them, then if that is the case, then who used to feed his camel, and who used to take care of his provisions? So they said, we did, Ya Rasulullah. We are the ones who took care of his provisions. So the Prophet said, if that is the case, kullukum khayrum min, all of you are better than him. Why? Because we are not meant to spend our entire life or all our time in the worship of Allah by ibadah and by sitting on the prayer mat. We also have to work hard for our livelihood. Indeed, working hard to earn your sustenance is an act of ibadah as well, and that is something that we are responsible for. So we find therefore that race is not a means of distinguishing people in Islam. Rather, value and superiority in Islam is given to those who have piety, who are mindful of Allah, who are muttaqi, number one, who have knowledge, who have struggled to learn about how they can attain salvation in the hereafter and how they can come closer to Allah Azza wa Jal, and that is through knowledge. And number three, those who work hard. These are the qualities that make a person valuable in the eyes of Allah and in Islam. Sallu ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. We now come to Karbala as we remember and we recount the masa'ib of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salam. Tonight we want to talk about how Abu Abdullah al-Hussein arrives in Karbala. We know that as Imam al-Hussein was proceeding towards Kufa, at one point Hur ibn Yazid al-Riyahi came with a contingent of about 1,000 soldiers to block the path of the Imam. And as they blocked the path of the Imam had to divert and move towards a different direction. But we are told in history that as he moved to a different land, there came a time when his horse stopped moving. The Imam changed, thinking that the horse might be tired. He went on another horse, but that second horse also did not move forward. And the Imam changed many horses, we are told, but none of them moved forward. The Imam came down from the horse and said, I want to know the name of this land. He called the people who are nearby and he asked them about the name of the land. One person said, this land is known as Alqama. Another person said it is known as Ghadiriya. Another person said it is Shattul Furat. Another person gave the name Taf. And different names were given, but the Imam was not satisfied. Then an old man came and said, Yabna Rasulullah, whoever has come to this land has faced some hardship or the other. That is why we call it Ardu Karbin wa Bala. This land is Karbala. Upon hearing the name Karbala, Imam al-Hussein calls Abbas, Abbas, this is the place we have to pitch our tents. Ha huna yusfaku dima'una, ha huna yudbahu atfaluna. This is our final destination, O Abbas. And the Imam then inquires about the owners of the land, and he is told that it is the Banu Asad. He calls the Banu Asad and he buys the land from them, and then he says, I wish to speak to your whole community, I wish to speak to your whole tribe. They are all brought before Abu Abdullah, and they all come and sit in front of Abu Abdullah, and then he begins to tell them, I have bought this land from you, but I gift it back to you. I have only one one request from you. A few days from now, we will be martyred and our bodies will lie on this land of yours. I only request that you bury our bodies, as there will be none to bury us. And as the Imam says this, after addressing the men of the Banu Asad, he turns to the women of Banu Asad. He says, if your men folk are fearful and are frightened to bury us, and then you come and bury us. And finally the Imam turns to the children of Banu Asad. He says, if your parents are too frightened to bury us, and then you come, and as you are playing with the sand, pour some sand on our bodies so that we may be buried. Ajrukum ala Allah. Abbas sets up the camps and pitches the tents near the river of Furat so that water access is easier. But this is the place that they will be allowed to remain only for a few days, for there will come a time when they will be told to move their tents away from Furat, and they will not be allowed access to the water. Ajrukum ala Allah. It is said that when the tents were pitched, Zainab alayha salam came to Abu Abdullah and said, "Oh my brother Hussein, what land is this? This is a land in which I feel very uneasy, for from the moment we have landed here and we have come here, I have been hearing the cries of an old lady, and the cries that sound like those of a woman who has lost her entire family. These cries and wails are such that shake my heart, and I am very uneasy." Perhaps Abu Abdullah al-Hussein might have replied, "Oh sister Zainab, do you not recognize the sound of our mother Fatima, the weeping of our mother Fatima to Zahra alayha salam? Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون.
Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein. شبیر تیرا سجدہ سجدوں کی انتہا ہے، شبیر تیرا سجدہ سجدوں کی انتہا ہے، خون حسین سے ہی، خون حسین سے ہی بنیاد لا الہ ہے، شبیر تیرا سجدہ سجدوں کی انتہا ہے، شبیر تیرا سجدہ سجدوں کی انتہا ہے، کئی بار تیر اس کے ہاتھوں سے گرتے دیکھا، کئی بار تیر اس کے ہاتھوں سے گرتے دیکھا، کھاتا ہے خوف دیکھو، کھاتا ہے خوف دیکھو، اصغر سے حرملا ہے، شبیر تیرا سجدہ سجدوں کی انتہا ہے، شبیر تیرا سجدہ دوں کی انتہا ہے، غربت کی صدا رن میں دیتے ہیں شاہ بے کس، غربت کی صدا رن میں دیتے ہیں شاہ بے کس، اکبر رہا نہ اصغر، اکبر رہا نہ اصغر، اور نہ ہی باوفا ہے، شبیر تیرا سجدہ سجدوں کی انتہا ہے، شبیر تیرا سجدہ سجدوں کی انتہا ہے، خود اپنے لال بھیجے آغوش میں اجل کی، خود اپنے لال بھیجے آغوش میں اجل کی۔ کتنا عظیم کربل، کتنا عظیم کربل میں ماؤں کا حوصلہ ہے، شبیر تیرا سجدہ سجدوں کی انتہا ہے، شبیر تیرا سجدہ سجدوں کی انتہا ہے۔ عباس تیرے سر نے دیکھا ہے کیسے منظر، عباس تیرے سر نے دیکھا ہے کیسے منظر۔ ایک نیزے سر بلند ہے، ایک نیزے سر بلند ہے، ایک نیزے پیردہ ہے، شبیر تیرا سجدہ سجدوں کی انتہا ہے، شبیر تیرا سجدہ سجدوں کی انتہا ہے۔ دستار اس طرح سے اکبر کو شاہ نے باندھی، دستار اس طرح سے اکبر کو شاہ نے باندھی، سب بیبیوں نے خیمے، سب بیبیوں نے خیمے میں انا للہ پڑھا ہے، شبیر تیرا سجدہ سجدوں کی انتہا ہے، شبیر تیرا سجدہ سجدوں کی انتہا ہے۔ تیری لاش کو میں قاسم ڈھونڈوں کہاں کہاں پر، تیری لاش کو میں قاسم ڈھونڈوں کہاں کہاں پر، تنہا حسین رن میں، تنہا حسین رن میں دیتے رہے صدا ہے، شبیر تیرا سجدہ سجدوں کی انتہا ہے، شبیر تیرا سجدہ سجدوں کی انتہا ہے۔ بھائی کا پیار دیکھا جگ سے انوکھا شاہد، بھائی کا پیار دیکھا جگ سے انوکھا شاہد، ہونٹوں پہ نام زینب، ہونٹوں پہ نام زینب، خنجر تلے گلا ہے، شبیر تیرا سجدہ سجدوں کی انتہا ہے، شبیر تیرا سجدہ سجدوں کی انتہا ہے، شبیر تیرا سجدہ سجدوں کی انتہا ہے۔ یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین۔
عباس 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 عباس، محفوظ قافلہ ہے عباس جو زندہ ہے، محفوظ قافلہ ہے عباس جو زندہ ہے، ابھی دور کربلا ہے، ابھی دور کربلا ہے، ابھی دور کربلا ہے، عباس جو زندہ ہے، عباس جو زندہ ہے، عباس جو زندہ ہے۔ اس نوری کارواں میں نوری ہماریاں ہے، نوری ہماریوں میں نوری سواریاں ہے، نوری سواریاں ہے، سر پہ علم کھلا ہے، عباس جو زندہ ہے۔ ابھی دور کربلا ہے، ابھی دور کربلا ہے، ابھی دور کربلا ہے، عباس جو زندہ ہے، عباس جو زندہ ہے، عباس جو زندہ ہے۔ نامحرموں کا مجمع ہٹ ہٹ کے ہے گزرتا، پہرے میں باوفا کا طے ہو رہا ہے رستا، طے ہو رہا ہے رستا ہے، کیا شان و دبدبا ہے، عباس جو زندہ ہے۔ ابھی دور کربلا ہے، ابھی دور کربلا ہے، ابھی دور کربلا ہے، عباس جو زندہ ہے، عباس جو زندہ ہے، عباس جو زندہ ہے۔ عباس جیسا بھائی سالار کارواں ہے، بولے حسین مجھ کو پھر کوئی غم کہاں ہے، پھر کوئی غم کہاں ہے، ہر غم کی یہ دوا ہے، عباس جو زندہ ہے، عباس جو زندہ ہے، عباس جو زندہ ہے۔ زینب حیا کی ملکہ کلثوم اور رقیہ، لیلا رباب فروا کبرا، سکینہ فیضا کبرا، سکینہ فیضا، ہر بی بی باردہ ہے، عباس جو زندہ ہے۔ ابھی دور کربلا ہے، ابھی دور کربلا ہے، ابھی دور کربلا ہے، عباس جو زندہ ہے۔ اصغر سے کھیلتی ہے، خوش ہے بہت سکینہ، جب چاہتی ہے سونا ہے باجاں کا سینہ، ہے باجاں کا سینہ، غم سے ناشنا ہے، عباس جو زندہ ہے، عباس جو زندہ ہے۔ ابھی دور کربلا ہے، ابھی دور کربلا ہے، ابھی دور کربلا ہے، عباس جو زندہ ہے، عباس جو زندہ ہے۔
بسم اللہ الرحمن الرحیم۔ السلام علیک یا رسول اللہ، السلام علیک یا نبی اللہ، السلام علیک یا امیر المؤمنین وابن سید الوسیین، السلام علیک یا فاطمة الزہراء سیدتی نساء العالمین، السلام علیک یا حسن المجتبى، السلام علیک یا ابا عبد اللہ، وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك، عليكم مني جميعا سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار، ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. السلام عليكم أئمة الهدى علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي. السلام عليك يا صاحب العصر والزمان. السلام عليك يا خليفة الرحمن. السلام عليك يا شريك القرآن. السلام عليك يا كعبة الإيمان. السلام عليك يا إمام الإنس والجان. أجل الله تعالى فرجك وسحل الله تعالى مخرجك وظهورك. السلام عليكم يا أهل بيت النبوة جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وأجل فرجهم.